So what a great way to kick off the morning, huh? Everybody inspired. Opportunities are endless, as we talked about. So as we go in, and I just realized in a brief conversation here, what better way to start out a conference than with two fantastic Canadians? So we're on a roll. I don't know if our next one up, we'll have to break that trend at some point. So as we make our way in, I was sitting counting. Did any of you remember in high school when you had to do like high school presentations, and we had this one girl who wrote like every other word was like, and like then you have to do this and like, it's grating to my ears. And I said, you know what, this morning though, how many times did we hear the words function and movement? I started thinking, I said, function and movement, function and movement, function and movement. And I said, what a perfect way to parlay into our next presentation than a man who has really dedicated his career to function and movement. And so how many of you are familiar with the work, with Michol Dalcourt? If you're not familiar with the man, I'm sure you are familiar with what he's done with the Institute of Motion. Viper, we all familiar with Viper, right? And PTA Global, this is a man committed to function and movement and sharing it with the industry so that we can share it to those that we serve. So without further ado, Mr. Michol Dalcourt.
Thank you, Lindsay. Welcome, good morning. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be here. I spoke very briefly with Cody at the break. I want to thank he and Dan for the opportunity for me to stand up and present and share some information. I didn't realize Christian Thompson was here as well from the University of San Francisco. It's a pleasure to see him. Celia has done a wonderfully good job with our team, just coordinate everything. So I want to pay a special thanks to her and to Austin as well, because he's super organized and he's making it easy for me too. So with all that, I just want to extend a very heartfelt thank you. My purpose is to really engage in a conversation over the next hour and a bit, to be able to illustrate, to convey, to perhaps share some ideas and evoke some thought around what function is and how we can utilize it through the different facets of our being, of our progression through life. And so the idea of the aging body is really blended with the notion of function. We need to authenticate our body's ability to be healthy at every stage of our development. And what's interesting to us is as we reach maturity in our physiological processes, we really need different inputs to maintain well-being. And so part of my discussion is going to center around this idea of what we call adaptability. When we think about the aging process, it really is two things. Can we be resilient as a physiological entity, and can we be adaptable? And if we lose those two things, the acceleration in aging occurs. And so we lose this idea of impairment, or we lose function that is impaired, and that leads to cellular arrest, and it leads to systemic disorganization or dysregulation, which typically is the body not working as it's intended to be. So we're going to go through some facets of looking at what we consider as being important. We're going to look at facets where we utilize different modalities of training. Now, I will say first off, in full disclosure, that I'll be using a lot of Viper exercises within the demonstrations. It's not exclusive to this, right? At the end of the day, this is a mass. And it's how we manipulate mass that really is more of the key than what we're using. So we have developed a lot of strategies in terms of how we interact with load, how we move the body, what environments we create in order to augment the ability to be successful physiologically. And so I'll demonstrate a lot of this with Viper. By the way, Colin, who started off, did an incredibly good job. And I was really impressed with some of the information that he gleaned. One of the things that he looked at was this idea of environment. So we really believe that the factors which affect aging are genetic, epigenetic, which is the environment turning on expressions of genetic pathways, and then environments themselves. And we really believe that environment dictates behavior at a cellular level, but also a systemic level behaviorally as well. How many people out there have a sleep strategy? And by that I mean, do you have a specific strategy on how you prepare to go to bed? Yesterday in the pre-con, we talked a little bit about, the notion of sleeping, and it really is chemistry, right? If I asked all of you to go to bed tonight and try harder to go to sleep, what I've ensured is that as you approach your bedtime, you're going to be awake more, because it's something you cannot try harder to do. It's something that is naturally evoked in our chemistry and our physiology, and because of the biorhythms, it ensues. And so what are some of the facets of a sleep strategy that you might have? Just shout it out if you have one. So interestingly enough, before we had modern conveniences, the environment that was naturally given to us by nature put us to sleep. And one of the things that we had was a diminishing of light at a certain pacing when the sun went down. Interestingly enough, when the sun rose, light was augmented in a very progressive way as well. So that is a wake-up strategy. And the next question I might have is, how many out there have a wake-up strategy, right? Beyond an alarm. So consider that for a second. If an alarm wakes us up, what type of environment is that in our chemistry every morning? That is a threat, right? A loud noise is physiologically a threat. So if we wake up to that chemistry every morning, what does that do to our physiology? Right, so looking at this diminishing of light, that is characterizing this notion of going to sleep. What else diminishes? Typically sound, right? In nature, sound diminishes at night. Sound augments in the morning. One bird starts chirping, then 10, then 100. And that wakes us up as light starts to come up, okay? Temperature goes down. Right? Smells begin to change. So we can change our environments so that we can actually facilitate a better environment to go to sleep and to wake up. These are things that a health coach can work with an individual to augment, because we are huge believers in creating environments that then dictate behaviors. And so what we might say as a health coach or a personal trainer is an environmental engineer. They create environments for the body to self-organize. And if we can put special considerations to these environments, we can start to change how our physiology begins to adapt in kind. Okay, so we are huge believers, and that was echoed in the conversation this morning with Colin, so I really appreciate that he mentioned that. So what we look at is, in relation to functional exercise, we're going to impact a lot of different structures. And I'm going to go through two different structures that are critically important. And the first one is bone. So bone is not only a very vital kind of element of our body that allows us motion, it allows us to move around, it provides structural support and stability. It also serves as a reservoir for certain minerals and fats that are absolutely essential in our development and our health. They are a factory of red blood cell production. So think about the transport of oxygen through the body for health, the delivery of oxygen to the tissues for health. That is very connected to the health of our bones. They provide a structural framework for our organs, and they provide these lever arms for us to ambulate, right, for muscles to exert their force against. And what we do is they actually, they are affected by our movement strategies. So if we sit for a long period of time throughout the day, what happens is we demineralize the bones. And so that affects all of these different aspects that the bones are giving to us in terms of health. And so beyond just what we're doing physically for a strategy of exercise, what we want to look at is how we can offer exercise or movement throughout the day. Because as was echoed in the earlier session with Colin, it is not enough for us just simply to do an hour of exercise. We need to find motivation, find environments, find an excuse to move throughout the day. Because if we sit for a long period of time, that is insidious because it takes effect in through all of our systems of the body. So what I'm going to have you do throughout this particular talk is I'll get you to stand up, but more so than just stand up, we're going to have this social connection as well. What I'm going to have you do is hug two people as we do this, and we're going to repeat this task a number of times through the conversation that we're about to have over the next hour and a bit. And ideally, if you can go in and hug people that you don't know, even better, okay? So I'll get you to stand up. Just go ahead and stand up and hug two people you may know or may not know. All right, guys, have a seat. Thank you. All right, thank you. So what we've done there is not only move our bodies, but we've awakened our intention to connect with other people. And the idea of socialization is very important, right? So you're self-organizing who you're going to see. You're engaging in a self-organized conversation. And the idea of making connections with other people fosters the idea of resiliency within the body. Because there are two aspects of stress. There is distress, which is the negative consequence of stress. And there is eustress, which is the positive adaptations of stress. And a lot of that is due to our mindset and our intentions around what we feel we can do and how much social support we have. Because if there are people that are at our backs, willing to participate in our lives, that gives us more resiliency because we can shoulder more stress. If we can do that with a capacity, a mental capacity, to move forward, that is in keeping with the idea of becoming more resilient as a human being. In the military, they call it 20x, which is simply you're 20 times as strong when you rely on others than you are by yourself. It's an arbitrary number, but the idea of fostering tribes and leaning on that tribe when times are tough is very, very good. And that's what we're doing right here. You're organizing this connection with other people, and we'll do it throughout the course of the day. By the way, the energy in the room was palpably different. The conversation and the noise was palpably different. That is a good thing as we organize these social constructs. Muscle is also important as it relates to functional exercise. They generate force. They add stability for the body. They act like biopumps. So for those that look at physiology, we have a lot of fluid that moves around the body. We've got blood. We've got lymph, which circulates and removes toxins from the body. We've got water. We are about 70% water by volume, and we're about 95% water by molecule number. In other words, we are a lot of water. And what we need to do is not only consume or intake water, we need to move it around. So if I was sitting down at my desk all day long, drinking my adequate amount of water throughout the day, that is not enough to get hydrated. Because what we need to do is push water to bind with receptors. That is what allows us to be stronger. That is what allows the connective tissue to be more dynamic. That is what allows us to transfer and move fluid around the body, keeping discs hydrated, keeping joints lubricated. All of these things require a change of posture. So what we need to do is understand that muscles activities and pressure of our bodies against the environment, like ground, really foster the fluid dynamics that is essential with health. And so we look at different postures, we look at different movement tasks, which we're about to observe, and we consider not only its effects on the joints, on the nervous system, on the muscular system, but what that muscular system is able to do with the fluids of the body. Okay? So if we look at strategies of aging successfully, if the problem in bone and muscle is that we've got loss of bone density and loss of lean body tissue. We want to increase the force relative to the individual's readiness. We want to increase the load to that individual. Now, they've done a lot of studies where they take a look at astronauts going into outer space. And because of lack of force, lack of gravity and ground reaction force, they know that the muscles will atrophy. They know that the bones would demineralize. They also know that blood volume will decrease. And they've equated that to individuals that sit for a large period of time. And they say that the same physiological decay that ensues in an astronaut will ensue in that individual that sits for a large period of time. The only difference is it's more augmented with the astronaut, but it's still present with an individual. So how many people have heard that sitting is the new smoking? We disagree. We disagree because if you're a high-priced lawyer here in Orlando and you hear sitting is the new smoking, what might you do? Class action suit, if you're a lawyer. What might you do at your environment of work? Get a stand-up desk. Now, if you buy a stand-up desk and you stand for 8 hours without moving a lot, is there a more immediate health risk? Yes. Right? You will have edema, right? And as edema develops or is present, if you have a blood clot and that blood clot is immobilized, you have a more immediate health risk. So the alternative of sitting is not to stand and not move around. If we think further, maybe it's getting a walking treadmill at your desk, but if you're starting to read 12 font print while gating at your desk, you're going to disrupt the oculomotor reflex and you might get headaches. So the idea, it's not binary. It's not that sitting is bad and standing is good. We need to manage our day-to-day. If functional movement and exercise are part of the same conversation, that is not just present in the gym, but is present in our overall life, we need to manage the day. So what we might recommend as health coaching is you will sit for periods of time where you need cognitive concentration, tasks and problem solving. You will stand when you're in conversation. That could be over the phone, right? And then if you have a meeting with 3 or less people, you're going to go for a walking meeting. And that might even be outside your workplace. Very interesting that if we change our model, if we go outside, that changes our reference point. And we may look at problems different because we changed our environment. We are now outside trying to tackle a work problem. So how we might navigate the workplace is not saying that sitting is bad. It's necessary. What we might say is you need to do all three. You need to sit, stand, and you need to walk around, and you need to trigger that or link it to a task that you're already doing. And that would be effective health coaching, because sitting is not the problem. The desk is the problem. The desk is the prison, because I'm attached to it and I can't move away from it. And if I can't do that, I can't change my postures. So we need to look for excuses where we move the body throughout the day in a gravity and ground reaction based environment. And that starts to lead to improvements in bone density. It leads to improvements in muscle function. So what we can do is change the ground reaction force. Here you see an individual that is on a vibration plate. They are changing the ground reaction force, and they are manipulating their body and their postures in that environment. What we can also do is we can go to different environments and start to interact with load. What's the first thing you notice about this environment, guys? It's outside, okay? Is Derek wearing sunglasses or not? He is not, okay? So if we're looking at good, let's say, ocular motor function, which is part of functional training, what we look at is, let's say, lack of rigidity. We want to increase variability with individuals' protocols when it relates to movement. Part of that variability is eye motion and light and brightness in your eyes. Right? So think about in this environment where the light is regulated. Let's say I'm staring at a screen, I'm indoors. How many folks would walk outside and 10 feet before getting outside, what goes on their eyes? Sunglasses. What does that do to the small muscle activity in the eyes? for their pupils. It shuts it down. So when light goes in our eyes, what happens to our pupils? They constrict. And when we go inside, and it's not as bright, they dilate. Isn't that important for functional training too? So the first thing I'm starting off with is not a muscular exercise in this frame, but a muscular exercise as it relates to the eyes. Why? Because myopia is a growing concern. It affects balance and coordination. What does the research tell us? Get outside, change your depth of field. Get outside, change your depth of field. Get outside, change your depth of field. Do we get outside a lot? No. Do we change our depth of field a lot? No. Because I'm looking at a computer or something in front of me all day long, and then I get outside and I'm looking at the same depth of field, right? So what we want to do is change our depth of field and get brightness in our eyes. That is not to suggest that we're going to stare at the sun by any means, but we want to get brightness in our eyes. So the first thing you'll notice about this environment is that Derek is outside, right? When brightness hits our eyes, right, our pupils will constrict. It'll stimulate pituitary gland activity, and that actually helps us sleep at night because UVB light hits our bodies, and when it hits our bodies, vitamin D production goes up. Tryptophan hydroxylase, which is a rate-limiting enzyme that converts tryptophan into serotonin, that goes up. And guess what? Serotonin controls appetite, mood, aggression, sleep. This is a powerful catecholamine that we need in our bodies. We get it by changing our environment. The next thing we're going to notice with this particular exercise is that Derek is lifting a mass from the ground. Can everybody see that? In the industry, we call that a deadlift. How many people have heard of a deadlift before? Probably most. And a deadlift is lifting a mass from a dead position, which is suggesting that we need to create an organization of effort where we overcome this thing's resting inertia. It could be any mass. In this case, it was a viper, but it could be any mass. So what Derek is doing is saying, okay, we're taking a deadlift pattern from outside the foot to the opposite shoulder. We're overcoming its resting inertia, and we're bringing about a deadlift pattern. But we're not just doing it in one dimension. We are going to multi-directionalize this, right, to create different lines of stress. This is really important because a lot of times people can't coordinate actions when they're lifting a mass from a dead position. So how many people have been on vacation before? I would expect most people in this room put their hands up. Maybe even this weekend you're on vacation. So if we're trying to get a piece of luggage out of a trunk, we need to anticipate, our bodies need to anticipate how much stability is required when I go and lean in an odd position and I have to do what to that luggage? I've got to bring about a force to that luggage which is not moving. But the interesting thing is that our bodies cannot coordinate or don't know how much stability is needed because I don't have the mass in my hand yet. So in my most odd position, my body has to anticipate how much stability is required for me to get that luggage out of the trunk. We call that a dead shift, not a dead lift, because we are shifting mass and translating it through a field of gravity. How many people do deadlifts in the gym? A lot. How many people do dead shifts in the gym? Probably not so much. But guess what? We all do it in real life. So we might suggest is taking dead starts, doing dead lifts and dead shifts in the gym is a very critical component at any age. Right? We might start with a lot more regression and a lot less weight in the gym for the older adult, but we want to introduce these patterns of what we call feed forward. Can I anticipate how much load I need to interact with and how much stability is required and how much neural sensitivity I have to that in my dead starts? Okay. This is another example of a shifting pattern. So we're taking a load and we're going through and we're lifting it up, which would be a lift, and then we're shifting it laterally. Now, a lot of times in the past, we used real estate as our recommendation in the gym. In other words, it was far easier for me to navigate the gym if I occupied a certain space, particularly years ago when there was nothing but machines, right? So I could lift up, But to really move across, I would start to run into either other equipment or other people. But nowadays, that is all changing. With turf zones and functional training areas, there is more space given for the individual to be able to manipulate mass. So what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, let's lift the load up first, and then we're going to take that load and we're going to translate it across or away from our body. That is going long under load as opposed to short under load. So everybody do me a huge favor. Can you take your left hand and bring it out nice and wide? What I'd like you to do is I want you to reach across at your neighbor. If you don't like your neighbor, you can inadvertently hit them on the way by. That's totally fair, okay? And as you reach further and further, can you tell me where you feel a tension? Shoulder, where else? Through the upper arm, through the forearm, perhaps through the fingers. And we're reaching away and we're inducing a load to the body. Now, there are two ways in which we can get stress to the body. We can get stress in a shortened position, and we can get stress in a long position. And when we stretch, or get stress rather, in a shortened position, that is very good for actin and myosin in the body. These are two proteins which interact, and they contract, they see each other, right? And that actin and myosin create a power stroke. They create an exertion of force which shortens the muscle and manipulates a joint. And that's very, very good. What we can also look at is the idea of going long under load. When we go long under load, that is still a stress to the body. But it's not the shortening elements of actin and myosin. This is the stretch capabilities of our body. So everybody take your shirts and stretch it. If you stretch it differently than your neighbor, what you're doing is you're putting a force through the body in a different way. And when you do that, you start to deform the tissue. Can everybody see my shirt that's being deformed right now? When you deform it, you depolarize it, which simply means that you change its electrical polarity. And you attract fibroblasts, which are cells in connective tissue that model down collagen, and they lay it down in the extracellular space. Here's what it means. As we age, what happens to our skin behavior? It loses elasticity and resiliency. Part of that is a fiber called collagen, right? I live in Southern California now. I'm from Canada. I live in Southern California. If I drove an hour and a half north, I would get to Beverly Hills. And in Beverly Hills, people would rub cream on their bodies so that their bodies can be more supple, their skin can be more supple. And part of that is the conversation of collagen. But we can put collagen in the body by lengthening under load, by putting stress in the body under load. And when we do that, we create the necessary triggers, the inputs for our cells to remodel, to get better, to get stronger, to get more resilient. And that allows our skin to be trained as well. And when we start to train our skin, we become more resilient, because this thing called skin, which is our largest organ, is also a stability organ. And if we train it, we are more stable. When we're more stable at any age, we can produce more force. We can actually govern movement in a different capacity. We've got a better ability to navigate our physicality. But as I said yesterday, Monday in the gym is never skin day, right? It's always a muscle day. And that's important, but it's not the characteristics of the body in its entirety. Does that make sense? We are dealing with an entire organism that commingles and organizes itself to be successful as one unit, Another thing we're going to do here is, this is another shifting pattern. So if you take a look at this particular movement here, we're maintaining our base of support. But as I lean to one side and I drive, I'm always driving into length. So in a standing position, what I'm going to do is work on the feet. I'm going to work on the trunk. I'm going to work on the thoracic spine, and I'm going to work on my upper extremity as I shift mass in a multitude of different directions. This particular exercise is a foot exercise, a hip exercise, a core exercise, a balance exercise, where I'm navigating different loads and I'm shifting them, in this case, in a box pattern. The idea here is that I want to create a strong body, not just a body parts. Okay, so I'm coordinating this, but I'm governing my center of mass over a base of support that is not changing. So the motor complexity of this particular exercise is diminished. It's easier. Okay? So that leads us to this idea of if we are aging and we are not confident in our movement ability, we tend to sit a lot, and we talked about this before. So prolonged sitting will dehydrate and thicken the collagen matrix. Is it ever a wonder that individuals have a decreased capacity in their posterior chain? The posterior hip and the hamstrings start to become more dysfunctional, right? So all of you are sitting right now primarily on what structures? Chairs. And what structures in your body are you sitting on? Okay, posterior hip, the glutes, and the hamstrings. The hamstrings are fed by the femoral artery. So walk through this with me. The femoral artery is in front of the body. It's anterior. It comes in through this outlet here, okay, through the inguinal area of the body. And the femoral artery comes down the front of the thigh, and there are 4 perfusing arteries that go deep from front all the way to back. If you are sitting on your hamstrings right now, does it make it more difficult to get oxygen, to get nutrients to that area of the body? Yes. If I move less as I age, I tend to tighten all the structures in the medial compartment of the thigh. These femoral arteries have to go through the adductor magnus muscle, which is a muscle in the medial part of the thigh. And if that gets tight, we start to have a diminished capacity for fresh blood in our hamstrings. Does that affect how we bend? Does that affect how we gait? Does that affect the quad and hamstring relationship if we're looking at muscle? Yes. The way we mitigate that is through strategies of movement throughout the day. So this time I'm not going to get you to hug your neighbor, but what I will get you to do is just stand up and perform 3 little squats for me, okay? Turn around 3 times in one direction, turn around 3 times in the other direction, and then have a seat. Perfect. Have a seat. So all these factors as it relates to functional movement are critical, not only what we do in the training scenario that is organized, but what we do as unstructured exercise, what we might call NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. It is the movement that we do throughout the day that matters. So what we need to do is trigger this to habits that we're already doing and stacking those movement habits on daily activities, daily habits, daily engagement that we already have. That is going to help mitigate the effects of sitting. Prolonged sitting, within 24 hours of prolonged sitting, our blood volume will decrease. If that's the case, what happens to heart rate? If our cardiac output is the exact same, but we've got less volume of blood, what does our heart rate have to do? It has to increase. So we now have cardiac drift, right? So in other words, it comes up to deliver the same amount of oxygen in the body. That's irrespective of, our nutrition and hydration. So sitting down affects our blood volume, which affects our heart rate. And over time, that might affect other health markers. There's an increased loss of calcium through the urine with prolonged sitting. How does that affect our bone? Because just like fibroblasts produce collagen, osteoblasts produce collagen and calcium and release it into the extracellular matrix. And the only way these 2 things are triggered is through stress, mechanical stress. It's called mechanotransduction. We receive mechanical stress, and then it tells a bunch of cells in our bodies to do work and release certain components, certain fibers, certain enzymatic activities to make us who we are. So if we're environmental engineers, it behooves us to think about what sort of environments we can create that add stress, the right amount, to affect our physiology, our enzymatic activity, our chemistry, so that we can get better. Okay? So even our aerobic metabolism and stamina begins to be affected, and it affects sugar and fat metabolism as we age. That affects metabolic capabilities, and that also affects our decline, our physiological decline. Okay? So what we're going to do right now is we're all going to stand up and do this exercise together. But before we do, we're going to engage an activity where we get the posterior aspect of our hip to increase, right? To upregulate. But we're going to do it through a task because muscles and nerves are all task-driven. Okay? So I'll have you all stand up real quick. If we go through a pattern of motion where we look at standing on our left foot. So I'm going to have you stand on your left foot for me. And you're going to load that left side with 80% of your body weight. Okay? So before we do, you're going to have your heel, your big toe, and your little toe anchored into the ground. Okay? So feel connected in your left foot with your heel, big toe, and little toe into the ground. You're going to bend about maybe 10 or 15 degrees this left knee. So what you want to do is create an expanse, an upregulation in the muscle, particularly in the muscles around the thigh. That creates a fascial expanse and puts a lot of now tension on this fascia lata, which is the wrapping around the thigh. That actually stabilizes the hip, the knee, and the foot. With good contact with your heel, big toe, and little toe, what I'm going to have you do is take the opposite hand, and I want you to reach down and away. So take your right hand and reach down and to the right. Okay? If you maintain length in the spine, and you take the pressure off that back foot a little bit more, so almost lift it off the ground, almost lift it off the ground. What are you feeling in that left hip? You feel that glute loading? Okay, and then you'd come back up. Now, if we're activating that effectively, we would turn it off too, because it's important to turn muscles on and off. We want to teach muscles, or nerves and muscles, that motor unit, to be able to turn on and off. Let's do that again. So now, heel, big toe, little toe into the ground. We're going to squat down slightly, okay? We're going to take that right arm and reach down into the right, and then you're going to take all the pressure off that right foot. Try to get right on the toes and even try to lift it off the ground if you can, okay? If you do this and then stand up and repeat that task a number of times, we're not only teaching the motor units to control the on and off, but we are facilitating recruitment or muscle activity in this posterior hip. A lot of times with individuals, it's very difficult to get hamstrings and glutes to function because of the chronic sitting that we partake in. That dehydrates the tissue, and then it leads to this kind of aberrant movement pattern and this idea of synergistic dominance, which is I am not working the muscles that I intend to work because of the environment that I put myself in more often than not. Okay, have a seat, thank you. So these are strategies to increase our capabilities of the hip, okay? Again, if we're outside and we're going through movement tasks, the idea of motion, mobility, will want to center around 3 areas of the body primarily. We want to create mobility in the foot and ankle. We want to create mobility at the hip. And we want to create mobility at the thoracic spine, which we'll do in just a second. And the reason why these 2 areas, foot and ankle, number 1, hip, number 2, and thoracic spine, number 3, is because physiologically and biomechanically, these areas of the body are designed to give us a lot of motion. And if we're restricted in any capacity, it is typically the joint immediately above that has to do too much. So a quick question for you. What's the joint that's immediately above the foot and ankle? The knee. What's immediately above the hip? Lower back. And what's immediately above the thoracic spine? Neck and shoulder. So let me ask you a very simple question. Does anybody ever complain of knee pain, lower back pain, and neck and shoulder pain? And if the answer to that question is yes, then that's typically not the culprit. If we study biomechanics, particularly chain reaction biomechanics, we will look at not the joint that is barking, but it's the joints that are not doing enough. Think about a chain link, right? If you immobilize adjacent segments, it's the one in the middle that's going to have to move too much to compensate for the other two. Does that make sense so far? So if we have a knee problem, chances are we need to look at the hip and the foot, because the hip is the femur and the foot is the tibia, and they come in and form the knee. So the knee is stuck between the two longest bones in the body, and it needs help. So what we need to do is look at the effectiveness of the foot and ankle to be able to function, to be able to move, to be able to stabilize as we do the hip, because that's going to save or help the knee. The same thing is true with the hip into the lower back. If I can't move my hips effectively, it is my lower back that's going to move. That rotation is still rotation. I can do it this way, or I can do it this way. And this way is going to be a lot harder for my lower back. The same thing is true with the thoracic spine. Give me computer posture for a second. Everybody just exhibit computer posture. You guys really fell into that pattern very naturally. I really appreciate that. So if I do this, so just go through that with me. If I go through and I start to round the mid-back, where are my hands, by the way? Right here, okay? So what position is my shoulder in? It's in a closed position, okay? Now, if I'm in a closed position at the shoulder, am I starting to crowd all the structures in front right here? Yeah. What happens to my arms? They internally rotate, right? Typically, what happens to my shoulder blade, everybody do this with your hands for a second, they go up, they externally rotate, and maybe most destructively, they anteriorly tilt. That's what they do. So they wing up. So I'm in this position right here. So my thoracic segments are flexed forward. And if they flex forward, the natural position for my shoulder blades is what? Go ahead and slouch for a second. Where do your shoulder blades want to go? They want to go out, right? So if you were to maintain this thoracic posture, so maintain your mid-back, but try to get your shoulder blades to squeeze together. So just go ahead and squeeze your shoulder blades together. What does your head want to do? Because it wants to get out of the way. So to correct shoulder position, we never address the shoulders. I should say we rarely address the shoulders. We address what? The thoracic spine. Because if I straighten out the thoracic spine, where do my shoulder blades go? With no energy and effort. They just fall back, right? Because that is the connection between thoracic spine and shoulders. Now, what's very important in this area of the body that we have to do 26,000 times a day? Breathe. Here's the thing. If I slouch down right here, is it more challenging for my body to use the diaphragm? Because there is no space. So the body works on the minimal energy expenditure theory, right? If we want to functionally move well, part of that is breathing in a large degree of ways, right? We'll teach 30 different ways to breathe. I thought there was only one way to breathe. No, there are a lot of different ways to breathe. And the more capacity we have to organize breath, the more physiologically ready we are. And that is health. So if I can't move my diaphragm very much, then what I'm going to start to use is a lot of accessory upper thoracic and cervical muscles to lift my rib cage up to get a difference in air pressure, to get atmospheric air in so that I can get oxygen in my body. Now, if I'm breathing 26,000 times a day and I'm using a lot of these muscles, are these designed to be primary or secondary breathing muscles? These are all accessory breathing muscles. What's interesting is they're also tagged to threat. Because in our development, when we breathe through these muscles, it is times of what? Stress. Everybody do this for me. What did you use? Right here. Did that make you feel good? You're in a fight or flight state, right? You need to either engage in something or get out. So you're on high alert. And if I'm doing that through large periods a day, there's a neurotag to that, and there's also a dysregulation to that in the sense that I'm using a lot of these upper thoracic and cervical motions or muscles to be able to induce breath. So I want to increase my capacity to let air in from the diaphragm. Because the diaphragm is our main breathing muscle. It is connected directly to the heart through the central tendon. And it has parasympathetic fibers that go out of it that connect right to the gut for gut repair and stem cell repair. That's pretty good. And they also induce a calming parasympathetic effect because they're innervated by the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve, vagal tone, rest and digest, right? This idea of calming the system down. So we want to breathe effectively if we want to enhance the effects of sitting. So if I was getting you to stand up, because we've sat for 10 minutes, so go ahead and stand up. What we might say is get into kite. And by kite, we mean long spine, wide shoulders. Long spine, wide shoulders. Just like the old school kites. Not the new fancy new ones, but the old school kites. So we have a long spine. From top of head to base of spine, we're going to create length. From right shoulder to left shoulder, we're going to depress the shoulders and go east and west. That creates space for us to move. And if we breathe from this position, by the way, everybody stick your belly button out. I know it's not, socially kind of relevant anymore, but push your belly button out, push it out. What did that? The diaphragm did that. Because the diaphragm pushed down on your guts and pushed your guts out into your abdominal wall. That is one great way to create an awareness in the diaphragm to help stabilize the trunk. Okay, and we can do that with any motion, any functional motion that we want to do. Okay, we want to be able to breathe into our stomach, so to speak, by using the primary breathing muscle. Okay, have a seat. Thank you. If we take a look at this particular drill right here, we are using, in this case, we're using a Viper for 3 points of contact. If balance is an issue with an individual, what I want to do is I want to create an environment of safety and let the body self-organize the task. So my right leg is forward, the Viper is off to my left. What I'm doing here is creating a deduction at the hip. So in other words, I'm closing this joint angle, and all my lateral line here is getting the virtues of a stretch. So I go here and I come back. I'm creating mechanical tension on the side of my body, that lateral line of anatomy. The reason why this may be important is because the muscle and the structure in the side of my body helps me with frontal plane stability. Frontal plane stability is paramount when I'm on one leg. When am I on one leg? Every time I gait, right? So this idea of not only sitting, but the idea of creating a tangible carryover from exercise to life, this is going to increase frontal plane activity. And that is going to help me with the sitting, the perils of sitting, but also gaiting as I age. Frontal plane stability, very important, okay? The other one is tracking with the eyes. So if I went through this arc pattern, and as a level of progression, I started to track with my eyes. Right? What I'm doing now is creating an unstable environment, and now I'm tracking it just with the eyes. Do I have to turn my head necessarily? No, I am tracking with the eyes. So that is good ocular motor input as it relates to activation strategies. So what I'm going to start to do now is observe an external frame of reference and follow those with my eyes. And if I can do that effectively, what I'm also doing is training balance, because I need 3 things to maintain balance. I need proprioception, which is feet against the ground. Oops, feet against the ground. I need ear, inner ear, so vestibular system, and I need now a reference point for eyes. And if I disrupt one of those, i.e. the eyes, then I'm still challenging balance to a greater degree. Okay? Closing one eye is a progression. Okay, so I'm going to challenge my body's notion of balance through one of those 3 inputs. Proprioceptive, okay, inner ear, or eyes. I need 2 of the 3, by the way, to maintain balance. Okay, so we want to make sure we're an effective kind of organism that we can coordinate these actions and get an adaptation to occur. So the problem with prolonged inactivity is it is a self-fulfilling cycle. Let's say I've got no confidence as I age in terms of my movement. I'm going to move less. Right? I don't know, Christian, if you're going to talk about falls prevention later on, but just a little bit. right? So what's the stat? Statistically, you're dead, and is it still 2 years within a fracture of a hip?
About 20 to 25%
Within a year. And a lot of that is due to the fact that I lose confidence in my body's ability to move. So I do what? I move less. And that is a big, big knock against physiology. So when I move less, right, enzyme activity, chemistry of my body changes very rapidly. So I reduce the capacity to regulate insulin, which regulates blood sugar, right, which then in turn has an effect on cholesterol, right? HDLs will go down, LDLs will go up, and muscle quickly becomes insulin resistant within days of inactivity, right? The use of fatty acids, the oxidation of fatty acids within the Krebs cycle is impaired, as are enzymes that are used in the Krebs cycle. Therefore, we've got a decreased efficiency to use energy. By the way, has anybody heard in the literature this idea of what's called metabolic flexibility? Okay, so a lot of exercise physiologists are looking at this notion of what's called metabolic flexibility. And it goes back to the notion that I'm stating to you, which is variability is very important. Right? The idea of variable inputs into the body, very important. But also using different fuels efficiently is a sign of health. So if I can switch from primarily sugars to primarily fats to sometimes proteins, then that switch and the ease in which I can switch from one fuel source to the next is a marker of health. So we want to have metabolic variability and flexibility. And to do that, we need to move throughout the day, and we need to organize stress in different ways throughout the body. So it becomes very, very important for us. Lipoprotein lipase, which is an enzyme used to break down triglycerides, which is typically triggered in anaerobic metabolism, when our intensities go higher, right? That is lost when we are inactive, okay? And because of that, we tend to accumulate abdominal fat, right? Which has its own secondary characteristics of decay. So the idea in the recipe based on Cornell research is this, right? For every 30 minutes, if possible, stand up, perform 3 squats, and walk around for about a minute, and then sit back down. Right? If you can make it more engaging in terms of input, with lights, with sounds, that's great. So, can anybody trigger or tag this habit to something that someone may do already? Because if we're talking about health coaching, tagging something to a habit they're already doing is better because it requires less cognitive bandwidth. So what might an individual be doing about every 30 minutes? Maybe going to the bathroom. That requires movement. So that's tick, we tick that box, right? What else? Smoking a cigarette. Yes. So I gotta move for that one. Thank you. What else?
Look at your phone.
Looking at the phone. So if I'm looking at my phone, maybe I do that while I stand up. Maybe answering a phone. Could some of your individuals, if they have a headset, just like I'm wearing right now, when they answer their phone, they have a headset. And as soon as they answer it, that's a trigger for them to do what? Stand up. Have we all been standing up on a phone call ever in our lives? For sure. And as soon as we hang up the phone, we sit back down. Is that one habit that an individual can do? Maybe, right? So the idea is we want to stand up and move around frequently throughout the day because it's functional, but it also helps what we do with all our functional exercise. This is very important as it relates to our aging process, okay? So everybody stand up. Perform 3 squats. High five your neighbor. And then have a seat back down. All right, thank you. So another thing we can do functionally is new and novel movement tasks. So I don't know if Ryan Glatt's in the room right now. Yeah, he is in the back. Everybody say hi to Ryan. He does a lot of work for us in relation to cognitive decline and behaviors. And we look at new and novel movement tasks. And if these new and novel movement tasks can be done with intensity, we increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor, vascular epithelial growth factor, all of these things which are like miracle grow for our neural net. So what we want to do is to say, okay, if we can increase intensity, if we can create an aerobic response, and at the same time, concurrent to that, we can expose new and novel movement tasks, we will create a cognitive spark that not only physiologically and biomechanically has an effect, but cognitively has an effect as well. So this particular movement task for her right now is new. And what she needs to coordinate is stepping to one side, or stepping forward rather, with one leg, and then reaching to the opposite side. So with her left leg coming forward, she's reaching to her right, and then the opposite. With her right leg coming forward, she's reaching to the left. So she is inducing a torque in the transverse plane. She's got to coordinate the foot and the hand sequencing together. And then what we would do is stack discrete inputs on this particular movement task. So in other words, we'd start to get more complex with this movement. After she's mastered this, then we start to stack it. It's not unlike this scenario, yes? How do I master this? I do this first. Then I do this next, right? Then I try to combine them together, and then I go the opposite way, and then I can maybe do the opposite hand. So this idea of stacking complexity while we're doing aerobic activity, while we're increasing intensity, will have a spark to these growth factors that are very important for cognitive function, okay? So I think today or tomorrow, Ryan's going to talk about, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but you're going to talk about this idea of flowing patterns and how flow with load and with movement at intensity are very good for the brain as we age. These are functional tasks that are good biomechanically and good from a cognitive standpoint as we develop. Another thing is getting off the ground. We call these things ground to standing exercises. We've got a lot of them. They can be regressed or progressed. And the ground could be a chair, by the way, right? So it could be chair to standing, because that's your ground, is the chair. So if we have the capacity to introduce these notions of going from the ground to standing back to the ground, we are doing a number of different things. We're allowing the body to self-organize a task, getting from a low position to a high position, back down to a low position, because he's going back to the ground. What we're also doing is we're resolving the problem of getting the pelvis towards the feet. So if you just look at biomechanics, has anybody ever just randomly just pushed a kid over just for fun, never done that before? How do they fall? So my 7-year-old daughter, Berkeley, when she was 4, and she was about to fall, and Dad was getting real nervous. It looked very dangerous until they fell. How do kids fall? They just crumble to the ground straight down, and what looked very dangerous was super easy for them because they just crumble to the ground. If I'm 75, how do I fall? Like the great oak tree in the forest, right? I timber, and that's what creates the torque. And that's what creates the impact to my body. Because if I just crumble straight down, there's less impact because there's less torque. So one of the things that we lose capacity for, functionally, is to get our pelvis towards our feet. Why? Right. We never do it. If we go to cultures, how many people have ever been to a culture where they still sit to go to the washroom? They still sit in a full squat, like when I say sit. They squat to go to the washroom, they squat to eat, or they squat with their families. Do they have a problem getting into a full squat? At 75, do they have a problem getting into a full squat? No, very rarely, because their body has been doing it for 75 years, and it has not lost the capacity. So if we can start to introduce the notion, functionally, of bringing the feet and pelvis towards each other. That is massive to regulate falls. Because if I now learn at 75 or 80 or 85, if I learn 30 different ways with my trainer or coach to get to the ground and back from the ground, because I do 30 different versions of these ground to standing exercises. When I'm about to fall, do I fall just as quickly? Yeah. But does my brain slow down? Yes, I make a more intelligent decision because I'm not in a panic, because I am now coordinated and I've got many choices to get to the ground. And that slows life down. Does that make sense? It's going to occur just as quickly, but I have more time to make a decision because I'm more comfortable with it. Has anybody seen a great athlete who plays slow but thinks quick? What's a great example of that? He's a quarterback in the NFL, and he's about 41 years old right now. Who am I talking about? He plays slow, but he's one of the quickest players because he makes a quick decision. Does that make sense? And so we can learn from that, right? We can make quick decisions, but we're not in a panic to make a decision. There's a difference. So these ground to standing patterns are critically important as it relates to us in terms of going through these patterns of motion, organizing ourselves from the ground up, okay? We call these warding patterns. In fact, we're going to do this in just a second altogether. But what we're doing here is we're adding some external resistance. Can everybody see that this is now the individual that is doing the exercise? I am the coach, let's say. And what I'm doing is I'm offering my hand as an external frame of reference for support. What the client has to do right here is they have to maintain contact, maintain pressure as they move away. So what we're doing is we're adding another point of stability that is the hands in a standing position. So if balance is an issue, we're going to say from the top down, we're going to create a ground reaction force. In other words, your hand is connected to the ground, so to speak. And the ground in this case is my hand. So as the coach, you're just going to stand there and offer your hand as a stable element. Does that make sense? The participant is going to push against that hand. Let's say it's my left hand against my coach. And then with the right foot is going to turn away, move their mass away, but maintain what? Pressure into my coach's hand, who is just standing there offering the wall, right? They're not really necessarily moving. They're offering that ground contact. What does that do? A couple things. The first thing it does functionally is it offers more stability from the top down. The other thing that it does, it has to coordinate core and trunk function because I'm moving away, but I still have to maintain pressure. So there needs to be stability and mobility at the same time. Does that make sense? I need to stabilize against something with my hand, and I need to move away from it. So it coordinates a pattern of concurrent stability and mobility so that I can effectively enhance motor control, core function, but I also help in balance now because I am connected to something that is not moving. Does that make sense? So what I'm going to have you do in just a second is stand up, choose a partner A and a partner B. So you're going to partner up. Partner A is going to be the wall. Partner B is going to put your hand against partner A, and then you're going to push away, maintain that pressure against your partner, step away, and then come back, all the while you're maintaining pressure. Okay, so stand up, grab a partner. Identify a partner A and a partner B. If you want to use the wall, you certainly can. All right, so whenever you're ready, you're going to move away from your partner. Once you've done a number of repetitions, you're going to switch partners. Jason, Did you ask, what am I getting out of this? Perfect. So we'll talk about that. Okay. All right, and relax, have a seat. Have a seat. Thank you. All right, so there was a question in front that said, okay, so what am I getting out of this? Great question, great question. What are some of the elements that I'm getting out of this? Did anybody feel an upregulation in this area of the body? Because I had to maintain pressure against a surface, in this case, a wall, which is my partner's hand. And as I coordinate a movement away from something, I still have to maintain pressure. So the first thing I'm going to have is an upregulation in this area of the body. That's going to be effective, because that controls the lumbopelvic hip mechanism. Number two is I have a stable surface to hang on to. Did anybody feel more safe hanging on to something with their hand as they moved away? Because I've got 3 points of contact. When I step, I've got 2 points of contact, and then I got 3 again. So if safety is an issue, right, I want to decrease threat, I'm going to give more points of contact if I'm able to stand. And so that is helpful for individuals that want to navigate the standing position. So let's say now I'm 85, I can do some seated exercises, which is fantastic, but I also have some capacity to stand. But I don't have a large capacity to do stuff standing. Can I offer, right, more stability? I will now place my hands in an environment where I can grab or I can push, because that now is a top-down influence of pressure, of mechanical force that my body can receive and then adapt from. The fact that I'm turning away disrupts what 2 things right here? Vestibular and ocular motor. If that's too progressed, what do? I stare at my hand the entire time. Why? Because I want to regulate ear and eye, and I don't want that to become a progression just yet. So I regress the exercise by staring at my hand and that stable surface. If I'm staring at my hand into that stable surface, I am upregulating motor control, because I'm looking at the very thing that is stabilizing me. So now I'm creating mechanical input to the body. Body can self-organize based on those lines of stress. I am now starting to factor in the idea of disruption of balance and motor control, which is important. And then I'm offering a safe environment, or a safer environment, for them to regulate and self-organize the task. Okay? Questions off of that? And we can use that all the time in partner drills, right, in group scenarios, etc.
Moving, as the coach, moving your hand when they're moving.
So as the coach, the question was very good, thank you. Moving my hand as they move, could I do that? Yes. Would it be a progression? Would it be a pretty darn good progression if I'm ready for it? Yes. Because I can still stare, but I don't know where you're going, let's say. I'm staring at it, but now you're dictating, as my coach, you're dictating where my hand goes. I'm still stepping away, but I now have to react more, which is feedback. That is a great consideration for progression. Very good. And then make them turn their head away while you're moving. Now you're basically starting to progress. Because if you have now my capacity to do all that, and now I'm proficient at doing that, you got me to that level, did my functional capacity just go up? In a standing position, in a multi-directional environment, with my eyes moving, my head moving, and my arm moving, and yet I was still connected to something that made me feel safe. That is layers of progression. Where we start, that's up to the individual, right? But your thought process, Jason, is right on the money. That is how we can facilitate a progression scheme. Very good. Okay. What we want to do is also introduce this idea of cardiovascular function. Can I use the arms instead of just the legs? because my arms pumping in a rhythmical pattern is very important. That resistance doesn't have to be that heavy. I can do that seated too, by the way. But what we're doing is we're adding muscular activity in a rhythmical pattern. We are upregulating the requirements for oxygen, therefore the need for energy, therefore the need for metabolism. And if I can change the intensities relative to my abilities and go slow and steady and increase them a little bit, what I'm starting to do is give the variability metabolically that will allow that metabolic flexibility. Okay? That will have impact on cardiac output, venous return, which is all muscle activity, capillary and mitochondrial density. Any longitudinal study on longevity looks at the amount of mitochondria in the cell. If we create a need for energy in the body, let's say we're moving throughout the day, that need for energy increases enzymatic activity, right, and some genetic expression, which puts more mitochondria in the cell. So, in the fitness sphere, aerobic activity increases AMPK, which is a kinase that increases mitochondrial biogenesis. Intermittent fasting does the same thing, and calorie restriction does the same thing. Now, in the research, they're not talking about calorie deprivation. They're talking about undereating. How many people have heard of a society that undereats and lives for a long period of time? Okay. That induces enzymatic activity, PGC1 alpha, which is a genetic expression, and all that leads to mitochondrial biogenesis. It's really important to use energy throughout the day, and we can do that through getting up and walking around. We can do that through little exercise breaks and through exercise. Okay. This is a level change. Level changes are very important. What we're doing to this level change is aerobically we are increasing the need for energy, but we are, in this case, we're taking the Viper and we're just going through an oblique pattern. So we are starting to three-dimensionalize and organize the body in a different way. We're saying squat, great, if we can do it. Mini squat or half squat, great, if that's what we can do. Can we start to add a shifting load somewhere in the body? Because if we said gym kid versus farm kid, what does the gym kid tend to do in terms of their exposure to resistance? Repeated action or variable action? Repeated action. They do sets and repetitions of the same exercise. They do loading schemes with perfect form, right, which is very mechanistic. The farm kid does what? Chaos. Right? Dig a ditch, we'll film you dig a ditch. Every time you put that shovel into the dirt, you're loading in a different pattern. It has variability built in. So let me ask you a very basic question. If a farm kid wrestled a city kid or a gym kid, where's your money? Which is interesting because they both do load training. One of them does it in an odd position with high variability, which is the farm kid. The other one organizes a high tolerance to load with very reduced degrees of freedom. They both have benefit, by the way. But what's interesting in terms of resiliency is the notion of variability has a direct transferability into life. Because if two people engaged in odd position wrestling, which is life, typically the money's on the farmer. Not the current day farmer, the old, from generations past, right? When they had to move their body, right? When they had to express motion in variable ways, that's life, right? Life is specifically variable. We don't organize the same way all the time. And that is to our benefit, by the way. Because if we do the same thing over and over and over again with perfect form, what is the dark side to that? Repetitive stress. And last weekend, we did our cadaver studies course in Boulder, beautiful Boulder, Colorado. And we had 36 students and us 4 instructors. And we went through and we dissected 5 bodies. And we saw evidence of a life lived. And part of that is repetitive stress that you can see within the tissue. So perfect form has a dark side. Because if that's all we do, we tend to wear the body out in a certain pattern. And you can see evidence of that when you start to expose different tissues within a body that's lived. Same thing with this. Now, right here, we're shifting a mass. It doesn't have to be a side lunge if I can't do it, but I can certainly do a side step. I'm driving mass away, and then I'm coming back. So this functional task right here is largely in the frontal plane, and I'm taking mass and I'm going long with it, not just short with it. So the posterior chain here is getting the virtues and the benefit of that loading when Derek pushes it forward. Right? We can regress these strategies so it could be a side step. I can do it just by squatting and reaching forward. And the added leverage or the added stress to the posterior chain increases the adaptation in the posterior chain. So that would be back muscles, hip muscles, hamstrings, all the way down to the foot itself. Okay? So aerobic activity, typically done with rhythmical actions, is really good for cell health, energy metabolism, and the development of mitochondria within the cell. So if we have an aerobic effort, if it's rhythmical based, okay, and if it's load based, doesn't have to be with Viper, but if it's load based, these have been demonstrated in research to have a very positive effect on the cell itself, which helps the aging process, or let's say diminishes the aging process, the speed at which we age. Okay? What we've done in our institute is we've enacted these, what we call 4Q schemes. The idea of variability. So we've got load on top right here, which is external resistance to the body. These are these two quadrants. Down here, it's body weight exercise. These two quadrants on the left are linear, which means less degree of difficulty, right? They're simpler tasks. The ones on the right are more multi-planar. And so what we get when we have load and body weight, and we have linear and multi-planar, is we've got 4 quadrants. That's loaded linear. That would be like a barbell squat, right? Or a deadlift, or anything that you might use machine-based. Unloaded linear would be a push-up, would be an air squat or a body weight squat. It's where you're manipulating your own body in one plane of motion, right? Which is really good for small muscle activity, type 1 muscle. Unloaded multiplanar is your body working in multiple planes. So still type 1 muscle, which is good for aging, for stability, but more neural complexity. And then the last one is loaded multiplanar training. This is what you might do as you're doing chores around the house. If you're lifting garbage bags or bales of hay or moving mass around in a multi-directional environment. They all have benefit. And what we might look at is, for general conditioning, can I consider all of them and train in all 4 quadrants to maximize the benefit functionally of what each of these particular aspects give us, right? So recruitment pattern and muscle, small motor unit activation, body control, and then overall 3-dimensional strength within the body. All of these have application and benefit to the body, and that's how we approach these loading schemes. Can we be variable in what we do in order to deliver a better outcome for the individual? Okay? Working at higher intensities, if it's appropriate for the individual, increases fatigue. And when we have increased fatigue, we've got growth factors that go up, and we've got signaling patterns that go up within the cell that increase the idea of cell health and turnover, right? So cells begin to replicate, they begin to grow, they begin to proliferate. And these things are, at the right dosage, very important for health outcomes, okay? If I'm doing this squat right here, the deceleration of this squat is going through the posterior chain. This might be very good for people that have that kyphotic posture. Okay, because we're loading the posterior chain, we've got to decelerate this mass. All of that is given to us through the posterior chain. Okay. Activation sequences. If I'm doing that, how many points of contact does he have with the ground right now? 3. What is he doing to that mass? He's oscillating it. So he's getting a lot of feedback, and he is disrupting a lot of balance. So what he has to do to maintain balance is right there on his forefoot. So that front foot has to be very intelligent to navigate the ground so that he can counteract the oscillation of his hands. Okay, so as I go and move my hands, I can start to create a ground reaction force that is very good for foot training. I can change it and make this bilateral if I want to make more stability in my body present. That would be okay as well. Okay, so this is very good for foot training and proprioceptive input. And the last thing that we'll talk about very briefly is the notion of disruptors and promoters. What we look at in health coaching that goes beyond just simply functional movement is taking a look at lifestyle, environmental, mental, and physical disruptors and promoters. What are things that an individual is doing to promote health? We want to elevate those, bring them into consciousness, celebrate them, memorialize them. And with disruptors, what we want to do is identify them and work on them one at a time. And as a health coach, if I can work on them one at a time, that's habit stacking. The more simple the habit, the better it is to start. Because then it reinforces the notion of, can I improve? Can I create a positive interaction? And can I get this job done? And if I can complete that task, the next task is easier. Because behaviorally, I've already accomplished something. I'm paving the way in the forest to do something with ease. So we look at disruptors and promoters in lifestyle, in environment, mental, and physical, and that's how we coach individuals. We want to promote what they're doing well, and we want to address what is disruptive to their bodies. Last thing I'll say is this. As a thank you to Dan, to Cody, to Celia, and to the whole team, what I really value from knowing Cody for the last number of years is that he's very inclusive in his spirit, and he's very inclusive in terms of what he wants to do. And this particular quote, I think, is very emblematic of what I believe this conference is trying to do, which is, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And in these moments, I always think of my daughter, who's 7, who's awesome, by the way. And I'm going to go see her this weekend, and I can't wait to get back home. And it always strikes me of what kind of constructs, what kind of relationships, what kind of ecosystems will we build to allow a better offering to the next generation? What will we teach them about what sustainability, what life is, because of the wisdom of where we are at in our journeys? Often what we look at is this marginalization of elderly. Would you guys agree? They're marginalized because we covet youth. And what I think we're losing is the wisdom, the perspective, and the organization and the willingness to work together that we learn as we age. And I think that voice needs to be heard more and more in this day and age where all we're looking at is the speed at which we're going and the degree of impact that we're trying to make, but it's all governed by a youthful exuberance, which may not have a whole lot of wisdom going with it. You guys reading what I'm... So we need that wisdom to be seated in that narrative. And so I want to just say a special thanks to both of you and to Celia for what you guys are doing. So thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you.